start. Okay, good afternoon. We are so pleased that you all have joined us today as we virtually celebrate our 20th anniversary European Union Day. I am Emmanuel Rota, and I'm the director of the European Union Center. Before we introduce our esteemed guest, Professor Michael Ignatieff, I want to take just a few minutes to give a little background on the European Union Center and recognize a few people. The European Union Center was established in 1998 as one of the 10 original EU centers in the US, with support from the European Commission. In 2003, the US Department of Education designated the European Union Center as a Title VI National Resource Center. In 2015, we were recognized as a Jean Monnet Center of Excellence from the European Union. We are very, very proud to announce today that we continue to hold both this distinction, and in particular, we just found out at the beginning of the week that we heard from the European Commission, and we are going to be a center of excellence for the next cycle again. This is a major accomplishment, both in terms of financial security, but also in terms of the recognition of the work we do on behalf of European Union studies and European studies, and on behalf of our large community of people invested in the European Union to secure the research and to secure the prestige and recognition that comes with being a Jean Monnet Center of Excellence. As an administrator, I have two goals. One is to spend all the resources available to make sure that we achieve our intellectual goals. And the second goal, almost as important, is that I leave the same amount, at least, of resources I found, and perhaps I expand on them. So we are now applying for Title VI, but at least 50% of my job in order to secure the financial stability of the European Union Center has been accomplished, thanks mostly, of course, to the work of our exceptional team. The European Union Center, as you know, is a team of amazing people who work mostly to help all of you, including me, to continue our research, our teaching, our pedagogical engagement with the university and with our community. So I want to recognize, of course, the crucial members of the team, starting with the Associate Director, Jonathan Larson, our Outreach Coordinator, Sydney Lazarus, our Office Support Specialist, Clem Fleming, and our Academic Coordinator, Lucas Harry. They are the key figures that make the European Center work and perform as well as it does. I also want to recognize our graduate students, our graduate student workers, who are also a crucial intellectual and organizational part of our center. There are many, so in the interest of time, I will not name all of them, but I hope you take the time to go and see our website, where you'll find all the necessary information for our center and all the fantastic members of our team. One of our center's most important traditions is our annual EU Day. For the past 19 years, we have invited an ambassador from one of the EU member states to come to campus and give a keynote address. But this year we had an opportunity to introduce a small but significant change. We want to invite a speaker who combines scholarly research, political engagement, and a lifelong commitment to the advancement of human rights and academic freedom, to emphasize our own commitment to these themes in a global scene increasingly marked by nationalism and authoritarianism. And in discussing who had these characteristics, we immediately agreed that an invitation should be issued for our speaker, Michael Ignatieff, who so kindly accepted to come here today to give this keynote address. Michael Ignatieff has accomplished so much. I think he has published around 17 books that, again, even if I just went to the list of titles, it would take way too long for you to have time to have a discussion afterwards. So I just want to give you the highlights by saying that his work is equally impressive as a novelist. He wrote 2 fantastic novels. One particularly, the Russian album, the Scar Tissue, was an amazing novel that I still recommend. It was written in 1994, but it's really a great novel. So if you have time during the break to read a novel, read this one. He has produced and organized a documentary, again, a fantastic documentary titled Blood and Belonging, on nationalism, that again was made in the 1990s and is still incredibly relevant today. So also go back and watch the documentary if you want to watch some TV during your break. But most importantly, of course, Michael Ignatieff has been a university professor in so many great institutions, from Cambridge, Oxford, Harvard, Toronto, and most recently, of course, the Central European University, where his international stature as a proponent of human rights and international collaboration and liberalism has been at the center of his intellectual and academic engagement, including, of course, the famous questions with the relationship between Hungary and the Central European University, which, of course, has been all over the news and we all know about. So from his commitment to human rights, to his commitment to academic freedom, to his intellectual production, as a fellow historian, I'm particularly fond of 2 of his books. One, A Just Measure of Pain, A History of Prisons During the Enlightenment, and his incredible biography of Isaiah Berlin, which I also strongly recommend to anybody who wants to learn more about this incredible figure who was Isaiah Berlin. Berlin used to be fond of reminding, with the words of Immanuel Kant, that humanity is a crooked timber and that the achievement of perfections is impossible for such a crooked timber. We are limited in our possibilities of achieve utopia dreams. But if I can push it a little bit, I would say that Michael Ignatieff also proves that despite all our limitations, a lot can be accomplished when we combine rationality, ethical commitment, and civil engagement. So we are crooked timbers, but we are certainly, or at least Michael is capable of greatness. And for that, I am very grateful that he is willing to share some of his experience and his reflections of this important theme, academic freedom in a challenging world. So please, I've already talked for too long. You're here for the speaker. Join me in welcoming Michael Ignatieff for today's keynote speaker.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel. I don't know whether you do that every time, but that was a hell of an introduction, and I'm very grateful to you. And I'm also grateful for all the people who've shown up today. I see quite a lot of people on the count, so I'm delighted that I can talk to kind of 70 of you. I send you greetings to Illinois. I'm in Vienna, Austria, and I'm very pleased to be asked to talk to you on the 20th anniversary of this remarkable center, and I congratulate it on being a Jean Monnet Center for Excellence. I know what a big deal that is, and so Emmanuel is doing his job, and I hope that enables the Institute, the center, and all its students to continue doing great work. Let's do some work together. I'm going to talk to you for, I think, 25 minutes, something like that, about illiberal democracy and threats to academic freedom in Europe. And then I hope we'll have time for a discussion and questions. Yesterday, I had a very good session with some students at Illinois, and I enjoyed it greatly, and I hope we can do that again as soon as I lay down some thoughts that I hope will provoke you to have your own reactions and thoughts. I have two questions really for you. One is, what is illiberal democracy in Central and Eastern Europe, and why did these single party regimes emerge after 1989? And then the second question is, why is it that universities, in particular my university, CU, ended up being targeted by these regimes? And to get at that question, I think we need to go back to the original transition after 1989. Those traditions across Eastern Europe are among the most important historical transformations in 20th century history. Europe was for the first time united from Ireland to the Urals, and that transition was supposed to achieve, I think, three things. It was supposed to move societies from closed to open, move the politics from single-party police states to multi-party political democracy, and third, in geostrategic terms, to move this whole huge section of Europe from alignment within the Soviet Empire to alignment with the EU and with NATO. So why didn't it turn out the way it should? These were the hopes, those three transitions. Why is the result so imperfect, so perplexing, and in some sense, so much against expectation, what we had in 1989? I think the first thing that we all underestimated in the transition was just how weighty the heritage of single-party authoritarianism was across this region. In Hungary, it wasn't just the communist heritage of single-party rule, it was single-party authoritarianism from the right under Admiral Horthy through the 20s and 30s. In Poland, it was Pilsudski. In Tito. In Yugoslavia, it was Tito. And this heritage, this political culture of single-party rule turned out to be much harder to break apart than we anticipated. And it just goes to show that history puts very sharp constraints on how fast you can transition to democracy. I think a second feature that we didn't factor in was that these were societies that had seen savage ethnic cleansing and genocide, in fact, in Poland, which was one of the major killing grounds of Europe, Hungary, where 600,000 Jews were exterminated, terrible inter-ethnic killing in Yugoslavia. And this either created monoethnic states, or it created a longing or an anxiety to create single ethnic states once democracy returned. So democracy was paired in people's minds with single ethnicity social systems. And this means that this part of Europe had a very different understanding of what democracy was, I think, than Western Europe, where from the 60s onwards, places like Germany and France had adjusted themselves more or less unwillingly to being multicultural societies, multi-ethnic societies, at least. UK, particularly France and Germany, would be examples. But Eastern Europe took one look at that kind of vision of a democratic society and said, no, we don't want this. This is not part of our tradition. So these were a couple of things that came into play pretty quickly in the transition. And Eastern Europe essentially said, we want democracy, but we want our kind of democracy. And that then begins to orient the transition in a very different direction. The transition elite that takes a place like Poland and the Czech Republic and Hungary into the European Union is a transition elite of liberal dissidents. And I knew many of them, heroic people. You'll know a guy like Václav Havel, Adam Michnik, the great people in Poland. These were heroic figures with a deep conviction that democracy had to be liberal, but there are not many of them on the ground. The transition elites succeeded in writing new constitutions, in creating multi-party rule, and their great triumph was to get these countries into the European Union. But on the ground, they were too small. They didn't have a sizable enough constituency, particularly in the countryside, to sustain their control of the party political system beyond about the year 2000. And in the van of their losing influence or waning influence, new counter elites begin to emerge: small town, conservative, unilingual, anti-cosmopolitan, Christian, Catholic, small town lawyers, small town people in the public sector, small town entrepreneurs. And these are the core of a new counter elite, a conservative counter elite that begins to surge into power in all of these countries in the early decades of the 21st century. And these elites, I think, are seething with a certain kind of resentment. They resent the liberal transition elites in their own societies. They don't speak foreign languages. They notice that when these countries enter the European Union, there are new constraints on their political systems that they don't like very much. The supremacy of European law, for example, is very unwelcome. The sense that Europe sets standards for products and services across the EU awakens a great deal of resentment. The other strain that the EU creates, of course, is that hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people, particularly young people, leave this region en masse once EU accession opens the borders. And so, for example, in Hungary, there are 500,000 Hungarians working across the European Union outside of Hungary. This puts strains on the family back home. It creates tensions between those who left and those who stayed. And so the European accession, which was supposed to anchor these places in democratic stability, in fact creates resentments, stresses, strains, and a new rhetoric of resentment at the price of EU accession that, as we shall see, people like Orban and the Kaczynskis of this world exploit very successfully. Another third factor, I think, that makes the transition take an unexpected turn is the impact of globalization and capitalism. Give you one little example of this. Many Hungarians had never had a mortgage in their lives. They didn't know what a mortgage was, and suddenly they're being offered mortgages to buy properties. They're renting under state socialism. Now they could buy for the first time. Sound like a great thing to be able to own your own property. But then banks, Austrian, Swiss banks, come in and offer them mortgages, but the mortgages are denominated either in euros or in Swiss francs. These are very hard currencies indeed, and these people, the people paying these mortgages, are paid in soft currencies, namely the Hungarian forint, for example. And they suddenly realize, as the financial crisis of 2007, 2008 begins to bite, that they just don't have the resources to pay these mortgages and go underwater. This is a very big deal because this is the crisis that essentially brought Viktor Orban to power. Viktor Orban said, I'm not going to have foreign banks and some European banks destroy the middle class of my country. I'm going to take on the banks and beat them. And this proved an extremely popular source of political appeal in the run-up to the 2010 election. So we need to see the ways in which transition to Europe, which is supposed to be such good news, awakened resentment, tension, stress, and then actual economic anxiety. In 2010, when Orban takes power in Hungary, he takes power in the name of the people. All of you have read the studies of populism, in which populism uses the idea of we the people against the elites, against Europe. This democratic majoritarian rhetoric was extremely influential in bringing Orban to power. The Fidesz movement said, we are the people, not the transition elite, not the bureaucrats in Brussels, not the bankers. We represent the people. And so once he wins this important victory in the 2010 elections, he sets about immediately using his democratic legitimacy to mount a major attack on the counter-majoritarian institutions that are part of democracy. And just so we understand what I'm talking about, democracy is not just majority rule, it's also minority rights, constitutional protections, rule of law, independent institutions like universities. And that's the ensemble of democracy. Democracy is not just majority rule, it's power checking power to keep people free. Well, once this party took power in 2010, they used a solely majoritarian conception of democracy to basically go after all the counter-majoritarian institutions. They muzzle the courts. They sell off the remaining bits of the free press to their cronies. And then eventually they begin to come after the universities, because the universities as free institutions are recalcitrant, unwilling to submit to their authority. So illiberal democracy is a very conscious attempt to use democratic legitimacy to attack the counter-majoritarian restraints on single-party rule that any healthy democracy has to have if we're to remain free. And it's all done in the name of we the people. And we the people means an ethnically homogeneous Hungarian people, an ethnically homogeneous Polish people, an ethnically homogeneous Serbian people. There's a little less of this kind of illiberal democracy in the Czech lands for a complicated set of reasons, partly the historical heritage of Masaryk in the interwar years, a more democratic tradition than the other countries, a very heroic tradition, public tradition of civil dissidence, which gives the transition elite more prestige, people like Havel. There's less strong Catholic Church in the Czech lands, and the economy is more deeply integrated into the German economy, so there's more to lose from populist adventures. That would be my hypothesis why this doesn't play out exactly the same way in each different countries. And then, so that's 2010 and what happens. If you move forward to 2015, suddenly Orban is not doing terrifically well. And then there's a gift from heaven, as it were, namely the migration crisis, which allows him to radicalize his revolutionary program. 1 million refugees cross the frontier. They surge across the Hungarian frontier. They overwhelm the railway stations. Nobody wants to stay in Hungary. They all are heading for Austria and Germany. But every state in Europe is simply terrified by the sense of their borders being overrun. And this is a gift to Orban because it allows him to radicalize his revolution and say to Angela Merkel, who welcomes the refugees, look, I am the one person telling European peoples the truth. You don't want them, I don't want them, I'm building a fence. And so he makes himself the spokesman for a radical new vision of Europe, which is a fortress Europe, which blocks the entryway to Muslims and poses Europe and poses Hungary as the defender of Christian civilization against the age-old, immemorial Muslim enemy that has challenged Europe since the Middle Ages. And so he does this. He uses this to mobilize a very strong domestic base. This is a small country that speaks a very particular language. I'm married to a Hungarian, so I know just how particular it is. Nobody can understand Hungarian. It's a beautiful language, great language, but it's spoken by not very many people. And so Orban appeals to a sense of nationalist encirclement and fear and anxiety that were these immigrants to cross the border, they would simply overwhelm, swamp, and drown the country. And this is, I think, an important explanation for why he maintains such strong domestic support in the country. He also then makes a very significant ideological move, which is then to say, it's not just the Muslims threatening Europe. Europe is threatened from within by liberal cosmopolitan elites who believe in a multicultural society and want to ram it down our throats. And the chief spokesman for that liberal multiculturalist arrogance is none other than George Soros, the multi-billionaire Hungarian-born financier who created our university in 1991. And Orban very adroitly and cunningly yokes the migration crisis to Soros, solders them together rhetorically, so that it's not just the enemy without, there's an enemy within, namely a liberal cosmopolitan elite who wants to overthrow national languages, national sovereignty in the name of a liberal cosmopolitan multiculturalism, which is antithetical to everything that Hungarians, Poles, and Czechs believe. The reaction of Eastern Europe to the migration crisis, as you all know, is completely different from Western European reactions. The Poles don't want to take any migrants. The Czechs don't want to take any migrants. The Hungarians don't. The Serbs take a few more, but basically their stance is radically different from the German and Austrian positions. And it's this soldering together of the connection between migration as a threat to the sovereignty of Hungary and liberal cosmopolitanism as a threat to Hungary that gives Orban, who is nothing if not a sophisticated politician, his battle cry for the upcoming 2018 election. And that's why essentially in early 2017, he suddenly and unaccountably, out of the blue, introduces legislation into the Hungarian parliament, which he passes in a week, that essentially renders Central European University, a university founded by George Soros, illegal in Hungary. That is to say, it is no longer lawful for us to issue the US accredited degrees that we have been issuing since the mid-1990s. And we become the symbol of this transnational liberal cosmopolitanism transplanted into Hungary, threatening the national identity of the place. This ignores the inconvenient fact that we have an awful lot of Hungarian students who are delighted to be there. And we've got the core of our faculty is actually Hungarian-born patriots who love their country just as much as their neighbors and want to teach in an academically distinguished institution, which we are, and their attack on us is never on our academic qualities, since all the international surveys show that we're the best university in the country. But I think I had the great good fortune, I think, of being the rector of the university when this sudden attack occurred. We immediately mounted a defense. We said this is an attack on academic freedom, and it's not just an attack on us, it's an attack on the autonomy of all the Hungarian universities. We're the only private university in the country. The rest of them are state-owned, and they are under much stricter control of Viktor Orban than we are. But we could see that when they come after us, they'll next they'll come after our colleagues and friends in the rest of the Hungarian academic world. And I think it's important just to notice how this was done. There's a lot of talk about rule of law as a backbone of democracy. And I think I'd want to contrast the rule of law and legalism. Orban passed a law which looked like law, sounded like law, walked and talked like law, but was basically a piece of arbitrary political interference in an institution, masking as law. So I would call that legalism as opposed to the rule of law. We didn't have the rule of law in Hungary. That is to say, our university, once this law was passed, had no legal recourse within the Hungarian system. The Supreme Court said we won't touch it. And so suddenly we were rendered illegal and with no recourse inside the country. And we then fought them. And people sometimes ask me whether this campaign against the university, whether we were able to attract support. I think it's very important in these single party states not to assume that, you know, Viktor Orban or Kaczynski speaks for everybody. In our case, there was a wonderful moment in May 2017 when we had nothing to do with this. Suddenly, on a Sunday, 80,000 citizens of Budapest marched past our windows chanting, "Free universities in a free society." And all I can say is you'd have to be made of stone not to be moved by that and moved by the sense that people understood instinctively that an attack on a university is an attack on democracy. Now, what then happened is, I think, important for a center like yours, which studies the European Union. We then felt we had a recourse with the European Court of Justice. So the law that threw us out of Hungary was immediately appealed to the European Court of Justice. We mounted a public campaign with the European institutions. I talked to every darn European politician I could find. And at the end of the day, this is the bottom line message, Europe did nothing. And so we are the first university who was thrown out of a European member state, and Europe essentially did nothing. And then you ask yourself, and this is a matter of political science analysis, why a very powerful multinational organization like the EU was so powerless in relation to one small country at its periphery. And I think the answer is that EU is a club of sovereign states. And no one in Western Europe wants to have Germany or France putting pressure on them. And because they don't want to have pressure put on them and infringe their sovereignty, they're prepared reluctantly to defend the sovereignty of a place like Viktor Orban's Hungary or even Kaczynski's Poland. And I think that's just something we have to understand about the EU and not be surprised or even disillusioned when it fails to defend the values that it purports to defend, and clearly academic freedom is one of them. Orban is a master of exploiting the language of sovereignty to head off challenges to his authority. And so the original premise of EU enlargement which was that the EU would somehow frame and constrain the domestic political systems of Eastern Europe and make sure they stay on the democratic track, turned out not to be true. And at the end of the day, my university had to leave for Vienna, which is why I'm giving you this lecture from Vienna. Don't cry for us, Argentina. Vienna is a wonderful place, but we still feel bruised and aggrieved that we were thrown out of a sovereign state with nobody doing anything about it. I should add that somebody did do something about it, at least in the sense that the European Court of Justice ruled that the entire legal procedure against this was a flagrant violation of European law. But that doesn't change the facts. Orban still insists that he will decide which universities can operate inside his country. So this is where we are, and that's not the final irony in this story, because after we were thrown out, guess who gets invited into Hungary and invited to set up a university. It's Fudan from China. Fudan is a fine university, and I don't want to join anybody's China bashing, but the reality is if you drive out an American university that lives by the criterion of academic freedom and import a Chinese university to take its place, you're essentially guaranteeing that, for example, you will have a political science department in Fudan that doesn't say a discouraging word about the political system of China or a discouraging word about the political system in Hungary. So that's the story I wanted to tell you about how academic freedom ended up being endangered in Europe. I think there's something else to say here, which is just to step back a little and understand the ideologies that are driving authoritarian populism, illiberal democracy in Central and Eastern Europe. Some of it's simple. It's nationalist populism, sovereigntist in its political theory, nationalist in its appeal to the public, deeply hostile to international law, and deeply hostile to what they regard as European Union meddling or to even the authority of the European Court of Justice. That's one cluster of the ideology. The other cluster of the ideology is a deep, enduring, cultivated dislike of liberals. I'm a liberal, proud liberal, and even a member of a liberal party. And we are designated as rootless cosmopolitan snobs who disdain ordinary people, lack any national loyalty or pride, and seek to impose our vision of multicultural pluralism on national cultures that don't actually want it. We're also anti-Christian, anti-traditional, and anti-family. Now, these are, in my view, mischievous caricatures, but they serve an important purpose, which is to create an enemy. Enemies are crucial to the mobilization and holding together of a political base. The politics of enemies is decisively important to all forms of authoritarian populism. You can't win an election unless you can convincingly tell your base who you're against, and liberals serve a very useful purpose in that in Poland, in Serbia, and in Hungary, and doubtless in other places closer to Illinois. There is also a shade of anti-Semitism in all this, but it's 21st century anti-Semitism. It's the anti-Semitism that says, how dare you accuse me of being an anti-Semite? The election campaign of 2018, which I lived through in Hungary, was dominated by posters of the founder of my university, George Soros, smiling looking as if he's laughing. And the cut line was, don't let George Soros have the last laugh. Anybody who knows anything about the tropes of Nazi anti-Semitism knows that the laughing Jew was the chief figure of Nazi propaganda in the 1930s. Why are the Jews laughing at us? We must wipe the smile of the Jews off their faces. Now, Orban is not personally anti-Semitic. Of that, I'm sure. That's not my accusation, and I'm not saying he's a Nazi. But this calculated, cunning use of ancient and I had thought discredited anti-Semitic tropes is a very disturbing element of this rhetorical appeal. But it depends, I think, and this will echo the conservative political theorist Carl Schmitt, this is the politics of enemies, the deliberate cultivation of enemies to rally a base and create support. And so populist authoritarian conservatism treats all politics as combat and all opponents as enemies. It accepts no limits to the authority of its leadership. And it's a threat to democracy because it believes it can't afford to lose. It can't afford to cede power, because if it cedes power, it's ceding power to people who are dangerous to the country itself. And this then creates one of the things that is a source of concern. There will be an election in Hungary in 2022. There will be elections in Poland. There will be elections in Serbia. And the key question will be not merely can the opposition put aside its divisions and mount a challenge to this kind of political system, but whether the single party authoritarians in power will give up power peacefully. And that's an open question. Now, it's easy in conclusion to think Hungary and Poland are far away, and it's easy to say things like they never had very strong democratic traditions anyway. That's wrong, by the way. Hungarians taught everybody a lesson in fighting for freedom in '56. The Czechs gave an unforgettable lesson in fighting for freedom in '68, the Poles in 1980 and beyond. So these are people who know what freedom is, and they fought for it in ways that can teach anybody in Western Europe what freedom and democracy is. So that condescension won't do. I draw a very different lesson from my story, which is that democracy is in danger everywhere whenever political parties seek to create a single party state. One of the things that you should all notice as American patriots is the enormous attention that American conservatives on the radical right are paying to Viktor Orban. The number of people, Tucker Carlson and Mike Pence and on, and I don't mean to caricature them in any way, but they're making a trek out to Budapest to sit at the seats of this, the master of this kind of politics. So that's one thing. It's a dangerous model with potential relevance, I think, for other countries that think their democracy is secure and beyond question. The second reason it's an important, what's happening in Eastern Europe is important, is that it used to be said that places like Hungary, Serbia, and Poland have nowhere else to go. They can only go towards the EU. They can only go towards NATO. Well, it's not so clear anymore. With the rise of Putin's Russia, with the rise of Xi Jinping's China, it's becoming a more even question whether they actually have another destination. If Europe were to put additional pressure on them to conform, they may simply align their geostrategic interests more closely with the authoritarians whom they believe are in the ascendant and with whom they have more in common. I guess my settled conclusion here, having lived in the middle of this single party state for 5 years, is just to say, look, democracy is very fragile. And democracy is in particular danger when majorities become resentful or impatient about counter-majoritarian protections, when they become impatient and hostile to courts, to free media, and to free institutions like universities. And this resentment can become lethally dangerous. It, I think, requires us to insist over and over again, whatever our politics, whether it's liberal, whether it's conservative, that democracy is not just majority rule. Democracy is majority rule balanced by counter-majoritarian institutions, one of which is the university. We need to think of the university as a counter-majoritarian institution, not in the sense of it's a liberal institution, but just as an institution that does one of the most essential things that a democracy needs, which is an institution whose sole business is assessment of truth claims. That's what universities do. The data streams in, the theories wash over us, the ideologies deluge the universities, and our sole job is to figure out what's true and what's false on the basis of the evidence. And democracies cannot be free unless that institution is free to do that job. And so we need government to protect us, and we need to protect ourselves from government. Freedom lies in maintaining this balance. And when that balance collapses, as it nearly did in the United States, and as it has done in Hungary and Poland, it reminds us that citizens need to do what we can to restore that balance by supporting politicians who understand the balance between authority and freedom, between majority rule and counter-majoritarian institutions, And we need to take to the streets if they don't understand it, because our liberties may depend upon it. Thanks so much for listening, and I'd be delighted to take some questions.
Thank you so much. Again, this has been incredibly stimulating for me. I think I'm still thinking about what you just said about democracy is in danger everywhere. This rings incredibly true. As Agnes Heller once reminded us, it was not written in the stars, let alone in some sort of Hungarian nature or culture, that Hungary will become the worst offender in attacking democracy and freedom of the press after the post-Soviet era. It can happen everywhere, and we have to be, of course, vigilant. While we gather questions that we are going to collect in chat, and I'm going to read them to our speakers, so please do not be shy, post your questions in chat. I also wanted to tell you about a couple of initiatives. One, which is, I think, particularly apropos for your students and for your graduate students, and perhaps even for yourself. The European Union Center, in collaboration with the Area Studies Library, has organized a book exhibit on the question of populism and gender politics. I think this is one of those areas where populism also finds its own identity, right-wing populism in attacking women's rights and gender fluidity, wherever that becomes a political issue. Populism becomes particularly aggressive on this topic. And so we organized a book exhibit that can be used as a study guide or as a way of knowing more about right-wing populism and populism in general, and gender policies around the world in a comparative perspective. As a final announcement, I also wanted to tell you that we didn't cancel our tradition of having a little bit of fun besides these very depressing topics that we like to cover every single day. And we have organized for the beginning of December, more specifically for December 2nd, the EU Day of the Arts, which is also part of our EU Day celebration, where we have a dance company coming from Italy this time, who is going to perform this modern dance version of Dante's Inferno. So you will find all the information on the website. We'll send reminders, but also please join us for something other than politics and depressing attack against human rights. Having said so, again, let's see if we have the first questions in our chat, where also I see that we are posting links for this for the exhibit. So I see the first question here. To build on the announcement of the new exhibit on populism and gender, was there not a step in Orban's campaign against CEU in which he targeted gender studies specifically? Could you address this question of gender studies and the question of gender politics for populism?
Yes, I'm delighted I've been asked this question, because it is a characteristic of this right-wing populism, this single-party populism. It's that it wants to wage, it wants to get into the culture wars on gender issues, because it believes that this will mobilize its conservative, often Catholic, social base. And so, yes, one of Orban's first moves after he had gone after CEU was to outlaw gender studies as a department and as a subject in Hungarian universities, which is grotesque in every kind of way, because there's some extremely distinguished scholars of gender and activists on gender issues. And he's gone on from there to attack, to pass a piece of legislation which bans the promotion of gay lifestyles or homosexual lifestyles in Hungarian schools on the grounds, it's not me saying this, on his grounds, on the grounds that this encourages pedophilia. Every decent person has reacted with outrage to the very idea that there's an association between homosexuality and pedophilia. But they've stuck to this kind of slander against gay men and women. Again, it's an attempt to find an enemy against which you can rally your base, and it's morally disgraceful. That's the easy part. The complicated part is whether it works. I mean, he's lost the votes of every single person in Budapest, because Budapest is a society, is a city, it's the largest city in the country with a very strong gay community, a very strong community of people who, welcome and encourage and support and have gay brothers and sisters, and et cetera, et cetera. So this is an interesting example where you demonize a minority, and it ends up biting you politically. And I hope it will bite him politically.
Thank you. We have two questions on the question of transition. One question on the sort of new generation, if you like, and is there a generational divide here at play, and an older generation that is reacting in a certain way to transformation versus a new generation? How is the transition to a capitalist economy affected these two generations, both positively and negatively? And finally, is there a question of transitional justice at play here? Is the question of the transition to democracy, any transitional justice effort like restoration play in the story you're telling of how and why the transition to democracy have played out in Central and Eastern Europe? How is democracy understood, unpacked, and so on and so forth? So processes of transition to democracies and their role. So or generational, economic, and procedural.
I think you see it in the United States that many people argue that the most serious political divide is generational, not even racial, not even regional. It's just what age you are. And that, I think, is also true in Central and Eastern Europe. I think it is generally the case that Eastern European people under 35 are notably more favorable to the European Union because it's simply enlarged their opportunities in a dramatic way. And it meant that they're flooding into Germany and to Austria and to Western European countries to, found families, raise their income, then come back to Hungary. And when they come back to Hungary, they see a place that is still lagging behind Western Europe. So their parents, who are too old to move and too old possibly to benefit from the benefits of European membership, are more inclined to support Orban's characteristic. And Orban's characteristic is to run against Brussels Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, and then cash the checks from Brussels on Saturday and Sunday. I mean, it's unbelievably duplicitous, but he's not the only duplicitous politician in the world. So there you go. So that there is a generational gap here, and many people have hopes that the opposition next spring, both in Poland and in Hungary, will do well because they are tapping into the future, and they're tapping into a youth vote that will go their way if the youth vote can be persuaded to vote. The second part of the question about lustration, which is, should you, when we think about the transition, should former communists, spies, police informers have been outed, put on trial, driven from their posts after '89? This was an extremely painful and difficult issue in East Germany, Poland, Czech Republic, and in Hungary. In Hungary, and some people think this is a real problem, rather few people were lustrated, driven from their posts. I keep bumping into people will whisper to me, actually, they were informers in the old days, and we all got to live together, and it's a small country, and forgive and forget is the wiser policy. But some people feel that this failure to make a much cleaner break with the single party rule of the communist era is one of the reasons why some of the political culture of single party rule continues to survive into the 21st century. It's actually a complicated question. I'm rather a forgive and forget guy in my instincts, because I think one of the mistakes you can make is you can just tear a society apart if you decide that your first priority is justice on the morning after your victory. And this is a real issue in coming up both in Poland and in Hungary, and potentially in Serbia if there's ever a change of regime. What do you do with the old Fidesz guys? What do you do? I mean, do you go into the campaign saying, I'm going to put Viktor Orban on trial if we win? I think that guarantees that Viktor Orban will not go quietly and will not abide by a democratic result. So these issues are very live and very tense, and there's active debate in Hungary at the moment about what to do here. There's clearly corruption in the Fidesz use of power that would justify prosecution. Is it always wise to prosecute? Shouldn't you put a democratic transition first? That is, get to a democratic transition, let these guys go off with their ill-gotten gains and move on. That's a claim, and it's not, so I hope you know, as your center thinks about this, you think about that issue, because it's a really live issue in throughout Eastern Europe now.
And we are indeed thinking about this issue. We had some conversations 2 years ago on the question of Poland's refusal to recognize reparations rights for the Jewish community, and how much that still affects politics today. I mean, because of course there is this forgetting, but sometimes the victims also need recognition. So it's really a complicated matter, as you obviously recognize. Yeah. We have a fantastic question on the question again of migration and how again populism affects migration, both within Poland, within Hungary, sorry, and from Hungary. I would also add how much freedom of movement within the European Union paradoxically weakens the democratic movement in Hungary. After all, I'm a big fan of Hirschman's Voice and Exit book. If you don't like a place, it's sometimes easier to just go somewhere else. And so the more active, I think we, even among our faculty, are some fantastic Hungarians who left at a certain point, right? And so is this weakening, is migration weakening the democratic cause in a significant way? Is the EU somehow having a counter effect by allowing people to leave Hungary instead of speaking up?
Well, I think there's students watching. You should get Albert Hirschman's Exit, Voice, and Loyalty down from the down from the shelves as soon as you can if you haven't had a manual or somebody else lead you through it, because that's precisely the point. One of the concerns about one of the ironies of the European accession process is once you get open borders, anybody who's discontented with Hungary can just get the hell out and vote with their feet and go to Darmstadt or Frankfurt or Brussels and start again and run a Hungarian restaurant and then get your kids into a good school and then up you go and you don't have to deal with Orban because you've made your own future, as opposed to tying your future to the future of your country, which is one of the key drivers in any democratic politics. You engage with the politics of your country when you feel, my future depends on having a better future for the country. A lot of people, because they have free movement now, can just move. And I think this is actually a much wider problem than just Hungary. I mean, cosmopolitan mobility is not necessarily good for civic virtue. People can just leave. So that's why I think the Hirschman argument is so pertinent to the question you raise.
We also, our fantastic colleague Brian Gaines, who also happens to be a Canadian like you, is asking for suggestions and recommendations that we all are looking for in terms of how we can apply the lesson of Hungary and places like Hungary and the question of academic freedom in our connection with China, in our relationship with China, particularly from the perspective of academic freedom and how much China is capable of manipulating its academic system and its alliances with Western institutions to effectively censor and limit the debate on certain things by leveraging, again, this supposed collaboration to actually promote censorship. Do you have any suggestions or recommendations about how to deal with this phenomenon?
Well, I think I said in the course of my talk, I don't want to join in any China bashing. And I think in general, one of the things that's happening, especially rapidly in the United States, but also in Europe, is a increasingly ideological approach to China, which is closing off possibilities of academic exchange and collaboration. I don't think universities should be in the business of serving the political and geostrategic goals of their governments. I actually think we ought to stand back from that. And we have some good examples from the past. In the Cold War, it was a lot of academics who kept the contacts up with Russia, kept the contacts up with scholars in Russia and also to a lesser degree in China, and maintained links that I think turned out to be useful for mutual understanding. So that's the first thing to say. Let's not have our institutions sucked into ideological warfare with China. That would be the first point. But the second point is goes a little bit against that. The Confucian centers that have been set up in universities around the world just look to me like kind of party political plants, and I don't think they meet the standards of academic freedom. And so I think I would not welcome a Confucian center in my university if one was offered to me. What I would welcome is Chinese students. I would welcome Chinese exchange and collaboration. Oddly, the CEU's medieval history department has a strange but very vivid and vibrant collaboration with Chinese medievalists. Who knew? But that's exactly what we should be doing, and schlepping out to China, and they come over here and stuff. There are a couple of additional things of which we need to be aware. When I was teaching at the Kennedy School, I had a Chinese student come up to me and say, one of the reasons I don't talk in your class, Mr. Ignatieff, is that there are other Chinese students in the class. And I'm a little worried that one of them is going to report back my pro-human rights answers to your questions to the superiors watching. That's an element that I think universities have not thought enough about, which is that our foreign students are being invigilated by the security services of authoritarian states. it's not just China. Egypt's doing it, Russia's doing it, but China is definitely doing it. And we need to make sure that our campus, our classrooms are not invaded by this kind of silent pressure on our foreign students to keep their mouths shut, and also watch their social media posts. I mean, CU has a student who was in jail in Egypt because the Egyptian Secret Services took objection to something he posted on Facebook. Well, these are real concrete threats to the academic freedom of our institutions. And so our engagement with China has to be very careful. And if you allow one final remark, there's a student I mentor who's just won a Schwartzman scholarship. Well, the Schwartzman scholarship is a huge, big deal for this kid. Comes from a very humble background, but he's got to ask himself whether he can have a genuinely free academic experience in the Schwartzman program in Beijing, because the Schwartzman deal is that they study in a free environment. But time and again, Schwartzman fellows have told me that when they go out into Chinese society to kind of, do their MA thesis on Chinese healthcare, suddenly the doors come down. So the question of whether collaboration between US institutions and US individuals and in China, and whether they can be free, is a very open question. And I think we have to be pretty clear that the terms of our engagement are extremely welcoming, because China has a fantastic intellectual culture. We want to learn more from China. We've got some things they may want to learn, but there got to be some ground rules here, folks. And those have to be freedom to speak, freedom to publish, freedom to research. And if we can't meet those conditions, then I'm sorry, we can't do business with you.
It will be hard to say to the administration of universities that are perfectly aware that even in our case, at least my colleagues in international studies know that sometimes Chinese students come with a student who is actually observing the other students. They are perfectly aware of this. But there is nothing they can do, because American universities seem to enjoy the amount of money that students bring. That's a problem. We have bringing back the question of Europe. We have a question. If you still feel like being as general,
I can go on a few more minutes, and then I should.
We should probably wrap it up, but I think we can take the last question on how much the fear of Eastern Brexit, of a Hung Brexit or a Polish exit, limits the ability of the EU to pressure these states, and how much they are taking advantage of Great Britain's decision to push the envelope as far as they can.
That's a great question, and it's hard to give a clear-cut answer. I feel in my guts that two facts are salient. One is that among the strongest and highest percentage of support for the European Union is to be found in Poland and in Hungary. This is a puzzling fact, because both of their regimes argue so insistently, I mean, even absurdly, that Brussels is like Moscow. It's like a replay of the Soviet dictatorship. It's kind of, and that's language I find very hard to listen to without fury, because it's such a mendacious distortion of what the European Union and Brussels is all about. But this language of anti-Brussels talk by these elites in power, runs smack up against a very stubborn, steady percentage of popular support for the European Union in Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, and also Serbia wants to get in. So I think that is a fact that narrows the options for these authoritarians. They may, Kaczynski may have fantasies about creating a kind of Polish Catholic authoritarian commonwealth outside the EU, free of these dreadful liberal cosmopolitans. I just think his electorate will not allow him to do that. And I feel the same a bit with Hungary. I mean, if you just look at little facts like the remittance income that flows into Poland and flows into Hungary from Hungarians and Poles living abroad, you just think, you really want to shut that tap off? I mean, it's just, the one limiting factor, however, is that an authoritarian populist like Kaczynski or Orban may be perfectly aware of the facts that I've just adduced, but they're not above playing it to the limit and in their negotiation with Brussels saying, look, you know, we're pretty friendly with Moscow, we're pretty friendly with Beijing, and if you don't, if you cut off our structural subsidies, we'll get the equivalent back from Beijing. Now, it's a little more difficult for the Poles in relation to Moscow because, you know, the Polish-Russian relationship is so and justly poisoned by, I'm of Russian origin, so I can say this with feeling, with Russian crushing of legitimate Polish aspirations. So I don't think they can go to Moscow, but they might be able to go to Beijing, and they're willing, I think, to play this geostrategic game, not to exit, but to leverage the authorities in Brussels.
Again, thank you so much. Again, you've been not only absolutely fantastic in your presentation, but very generous with your answers and very open with your thoughts. We are very grateful. I hope you are contributing, as certainly in my case, to constant reflection on this theme. Again, democracy is in danger everywhere, and so this is not the end of this conversation, unfortunately. This is just a reminder of its importance and how important it is for all of us not to imagine that what's happening in Hungary, Poland, again, is the result of special local situations, although there is local context. These are truly global problems that we need to figure out collectively. So thank you again, Professor Ignatieff. Thank you, Michael Ignatieff, for being here. Thank you again, all of you, for being here. I hope to see you for the EU Day of the Arts. I hope you consult our book exhibition on populism and gender. I hope you continue to be the good friends of the European Union Center that you normally are. Thank you, and I hope to stay in touch.
Good night, everybody. Thanks for listening.